Hi everyone, welcome to today's video where I'm going to be baking some British goodies. I moved to France over 20 years ago now, but I still really enjoy baking British cakes and biscuits. They're still my favourite thing to eat, and even though I can't get quite the right ingredients here, I make it work. I make little changes here and there. Sometimes I'll buy an ingredient in England and bring it back home. But it just is such a fun thing for me to do, to bring a little bit of England to my kitchen. So here, the first thing I'm making are classic scones. This recipe I actually got from BBC Good Food, and it's by Jane Hornby, and I love it. It's great. The first thing you need to do is warm up some milk, 175 millilitres of milk, and then to the warm milk you add a squeeze of lemon juice and a little bit of vanilla extract. Then you saw me earlier putting 350 grams of plain flour into a bowl. Now the recipe says self-raising flour, but I can't get that here, so I use plain flour, and I increased the amount of baking powder, so I've put 2 teaspoons of baking powder in there and a little bit of salt. Now I'm adding 85 grams of butter that I cut into small pieces. And this next bit you can do by hand. You can rub in the butter to the flour by hand, but I like doing it in my machine. It just makes it a lot easier. So you put it in the machine and let it whiz round until the mixture resembles breadcrumbs. When the flour and butter resemble breadcrumbs, you add the milk, lemon and vanilla mixture to it. Now this makes a very, very sticky dough, so it's important to have a well-floured work surface. I've put quite a lot of flour down here because otherwise the dough is just really unmanageable. So take the mixture out of the bowl and put it onto the well-floured work surface. And here I try and cover it with flour just so that it doesn't stick to either my hands or the work surface. I just pat it out until it's about 1.5 centimeters thick. You can use a rolling pin, but I really don't think it's worth using a rolling pin for such a small amount of dough. And it doesn't need to be very flat. It does need to have quite a lot of thickness so that it rises really well. I decided to use quite a small cutter here because I wanted to take some to my friends. I think it's about 3 centimeters diameter. And the dough does stick to the cookie cutter quite a lot, so what I do is I swirl it around in the flour to coat the inside, and that really helps the dough to not stick. Here I'm making an egg glaze for the scones. So I beat up 1 whole egg, and I'm going to use a pastry brush to brush that egg onto each scone before it goes in the oven. I put a baking sheet in the oven while it was heating up so that it would get very hot, and that just gives the scones a really good kick start and helps them to rise really, really well. In the oven they go at 200 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. Flapjacks are actually my favourite British biscuits, or would you call them cakes? I'm not really sure. Anyway, this recipe comes from a cookbook that I had when I was a little girl that I've kept all these years, and this recipe is just brilliant. I love it. It's so simple and it tastes amazing. So you need 125 grams of butter, 60 grams of soft brown sugar, and 1 tablespoon of golden syrup. So golden syrup is the ingredient that I have to buy in England and bring back here because you can't find it here at all. So you have to melt those ingredients together in a pan on the stove until they're completely melted, and then we're just going to add the oats to those in a minute. So that's all nicely melted together, and now we're going to add 250 grams of oats. And I also like to add a little bit of salt, about a teaspoon of salt. You just mix that up really well so that the oats are completely coated. I'm just going to line a baking dish, a square baking dish. It's important to line it because flapjacks do have a tendency to stick to the tins that they're cooked in. So I line it with baking parchment and it makes it a lot easier to take it out of the tin afterwards. So I just pour the whole lot in there and then press it down with the back of the wooden spoon. The flapjacks bake in the oven at 180 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes until they're golden brown. Then you need to cut the flapjacks into small squares, and you need to do this while it's warm, otherwise the flapjacks will be too brittle and won't cut properly. And tea bread is probably a cake that you've not heard of before. Basically, the principle is you soak the fruit in tea and then use that mixture to make your cake. And it gives a really moist, delicious, spicy cake, and I love it. Now this recipe is from another cookbook that I've had for years. I think my mum bought it for me before I was even married. It's the Good Housekeeping cookbook. Now the recipe calls for soaking the fruit overnight in cold tea, except I wasn't organised at all and I didn't realise that until an hour before I wanted to make the cake. So I decided to soak it in hot tea instead, and it actually worked really well. The fruit was perfectly soaked and the cake was very moist at the end, so I shall be doing that again. So you need 350 grams of dried fruit. That can be raisins, sultanas, currants, or a mixture. It's up to you. And you soak it in 300 milliliters of cold tea if you're going to do it overnight, or hot tea if, like me, you're just going to do it for an hour. Once the fruit is soaked, you add the rest of the ingredients. So 1 egg, 225 grams of plain wholemeal flour, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and half a teaspoon of ground mixed spice. So I didn't have any ground mixed spice, and instead I added a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of ginger, a little bit of nutmeg, and it came to around a half teaspoon. I also added a little bit of salt just to bring out the flavour, and I'm mixing it really well so that it's well incorporated. And I'm going to line a loaf tin here. Now, this is a really good technique if you're like me, you have trouble lining cake tins with baking parchment. So I screw it up in a ball, and it just makes it a lot easier to manipulate and take the form of the tin. And then you just pour the batter into the loaf tin and bake it in the oven at 180 degrees Celsius for about an hour. You'll know when the tea bread is cooked when a skewer or a knife comes out clean, and this is perfect. So there you are, homemade British cakes and biscuits made here in France by a Brit who still loves British food. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow along for more content like this. See you next time. Bye.